This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Professor Lee, will increasing the exemption or increasing the capital gains tax, will that improve or will that help deal with the productivity crisis that Canada is in?
Reducing or increasing?
Well, they are planning to increase the inclusion rate to 66%, and will that help productivity?
I've certainly read as much as I possibly can of the research on this, the peer-reviewed research, and I think it's my judgment that the research, the consensus or the majority consensus, is that it's not going to help. It's not going to help productivity.
Okay, so it's beyond your opinion. This is a consensus opinion.
I'm quoting
the
research I've read, the peer-reviewed journals I've read. Of course, there's enormous numbers, as I'm sure you realize, but the ones I've read, and I try and read the stars, if I can put it that way, the academic stars, because they're of a higher quality in the higher quality journals, and that's my judgment. Professor Mintz, I've mentioned him already because he has published over 400 articles in peer-reviewed journals. It's an unimaginable number. It's on his website, by the way. I mean, if you publish 10 or 20 articles in a year, in a life, it's an amazing life. But I mention him because this is his expertise. He is a tax accountant.
If I can get down to some of the points that you got into in your opening statement, you said the estimate is that the increase to the capital gains inclusion rate will suck $90 billion out of the Canadian economy. Is that correct?
That's the number I'm quoting from Professor Mintz's study. That's right.
Okay, so that $90 billion, dividing that out, that it itself results in a significant decline in Canada's per capita GDP?
3% decline in GDP.
Okay, so Canada, you said that over the last 10 years, or actually you said 9 years, you said since 2015, roughly coinciding with when this government took office, capital in Canada is shrinking.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
The argument I've been making is that because we are in this unique situation, we're right next door to the largest, most powerful, I don't have to repeat all that, and it is seen as the risk-free rate of return in the sense it's the one country in the world where wealthy people want to go because they're not worried about being expropriated by their own government, Russia, China, and so forth. And so I use, and I teach this to the students, I use capital investment, foreign investment flows, as a proxy for attractiveness of the country. So when more investments flowing out of the country than into the country, investors are voting with their feet, and they're saying, you're not as good as alternatives. Okay. And right now, I believe investors are saying they do not see Canada. It's not that we're a bad country, it's just that there's better alternatives in the United States.
So the Library of Parliament has put out that got this right from their website, that there's a almost $500 billion imbalance in investment between Canada and the United States. Canada investment used to flow into Canada positively, and now it's flowing negatively into the United States. So this $500 billion differential in investment, could you explain what that means in terms of lost jobs, lost in investment opportunity, lost quality of life, lost ability of policymakers or governments to deliver public services?
I'm going to quote again, and forgive me because I read huge amounts and I have guest speakers coming in. I had Philip Cross out, the very, very senior statistician for 35 years, to my class on this very question of investment. And he said, if you want to know how any economy is going to be doing in about 3 years from now, look at aggregate capital, private capital investment today. Because that's the investment in the factories, the equipment, the technologies that are going to produce the jobs, but there's a lag from the time you start the investment to the time you build it and you get it up and running. So it's a very useful metric for MPs to say, let's look at aggregate private capital investment today, and we'll have a pretty good idea how the economy is going to be doing in about 3 years with a lag of 3 years. So when you have a deficit and the investment is going down as it's doing, this is a very bad sign because it means we're building less businesses and less investment in the future. And in fact, all the studies on productivity are showing that we are massively underinvesting on both worker training and R&D and CapEx in our businesses relative to the U.S. There's no mystery to the productivity crisis.
Okay, so this means that Canada is not getting investment in tools, in technology, in IT systems, in the kinds of things that workers need in order to make them more productive, in order to earn larger paychecks, have better paying jobs, pay more taxes, receive more public services. Is that
Exactly.
What-
I mean, that's what Robert Asselin was arguing too. He said this feeds back into the social programs because we need the cash flow, we need the revenues from taxation to fund the social programs.
It's fair to say that all of the other budget asks that we're hearing at this committee really depend on addressing the very issue that you have raised here, that in Canada, taxes, subsidies, regulations, money printing, all of these things you announced
Absolutely.
in your
Absolutely.
first
Yes.
sentence are imperiling the ability of to maintain public services.
It's absolutely essential that we create a positive investment climate that encourages businesses and investors to invest here, especially when we're right next door. If we were halfway around the world, it might not be as much of a problem, but we're right next door to this giant
Just time
machine.
for another point or another question for another your ability to get in another point here. It's not just the United States, though. Canada compared to other peer countries other than the United States. Could you just finish with that?
Compared to the OECD, which really struck me when I saw that one. I mean, I knew we were always on the short end of the stick compared to the United States, but when I thought that when the OECD are out competing, they're getting capital per worker than we are compared to the OECD countries. And the OECD countries are high taxation countries, high regulation countries. So that's what was so astonishing when we're getting beaten by the OECD. That's a very bad sign.
The Canadian Climate Institute estimates that Canadian emissions would be 41% higher by 2030 without government measures. And this is equivalent to taking 69 million cars off the road. And of course, the government, and as someone who's very concerned about climate and the need to meet our targets, I think this is a very positive result. And we do have a very comprehensive plan in place to further fight climate change, but not every party has a public plan on climate action. Do you believe that Canadians deserve to know each political party's strategy to address climate change?
We are always happy. Did you want to speak? Good.
Thank you so much for your question. And the Green Budget Coalition advances our recommendations on an annual basis as the issues of climate change and biodiversity loss are universal and not beholden to any election cycle. So we're here today to recognize it's a fine balance between spending within your means and taking necessary actions. But what's not up for debate is that nature is our strongest asset to address a changing climate, and it's also it provides for Canadians, whether it is our economy, whether it is our communities and families. Those aspects are not up for debate. So while we encourage all political parties to prioritize these crises, we remain nonpartisan in the fact that these are challenges that we will be facing regardless, and all Canadians will have to deal with at some point.
Thank you. And, somebody from the East Coast of Canada, I celebrate the potential of the green economy, and so pleased that Bill C-49 has passed and we can start to get to work.
Professor Lee, I'm in the unfortunate position of having had my colleague, Mr. Kelly, ask every excellent question that I would have ever asked. I'm going to retrod some of that ground with you, but maybe from a slightly different angle. I want to go back to the comments of the Senior Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, which were made on March 26th of this year. And in her speech, she said, productivity is a way to inoculate the economy against inflation. An economy with low productivity can grow only so quickly before inflation sets in, but an economy with strong productivity can have faster growth, more jobs, and higher wages with less risk of inflation. You've seen those signs that say, in emergency, break glass. Well, it's time to break the glass. Those are very serious comments from a high-ranking official at the Bank of Canada. On April 16th, the government tabled Budget 2024. That was only 20 days later. And in that budget, they increased the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66 2/3%. And you commented earlier that based on the peer review reading that you've done, that won't help the situation. So I can't understand why a government would take a policy measure that would have the exact opposite effect of the advice received from a very high-ranking official at the Bank of Canada. Can you square that circle for me?
I can. I mean, I just want to make clear, because I'm a numbers guy that always likes to quote numbers, but now I'm going to give you my judgment. We do that in class. We talk about judgments of the data. I think the people that are really committed perfectly legitimately, philosophically, to issues of social justice, and those that I'm using that as a phrase to capture a lot of things, including concern about inequality. See capital gains as, I don't agree with that view whatsoever. I'm sure you understand that, but see capital gains as somehow inappropriate, or and it should be confiscated. That's what I call the Argentine model. That's what the European, and I don't think we should go down that road, because then you discourage investment in the jobs and the companies and the technologies of tomorrow.
Well, and in fact, to your point, isn't creating policies that actually create a worse productivity damaging to the ultimate goal of having social justice? Because don't you need a robust economy that's producing jobs, that's producing wealth, that's improving people's standards of living in order that they can have social justice?
Yes, I mean, it's counterproductive, and that's why, I mean, I've been arguing, not only here but elsewhere, that this is not an argument against government policy, or government having policies to help low-income people, or social policies. It's just that you have to, I mean, Anne McClellan has been saying this, John Manley's been saying this, you've got to generate the wealth in order to have that revenue base to support social policies and social and income support. And what we're experiencing is a decline in our standard of living.
Thank you, Mr. Harp and Mr. Larkin. I listened very carefully to what you said, and it reminded me of my great colleague Larry Maguire, who brought forward his bill C-208 a couple of years ago. And I was thinking, listening to him, thinking, it's just terrible that with the agricultural industry and this government, it always seems like one step forward and two steps back. And what I mean by that is Mr. Maguire's bill was basically intended to lower the tax burden on intergenerational farm family transfers in order to make sure that these family farms could stay in the family as opposed to being sold to total strangers. And then in this budget, that bill got passed, and now in this budget, the capital gains tax inclusion rate was increased, which takes you back again 2 steps. Would you agree with that view?
Absolutely. It's really interesting. In the farm sector, we have a saying, but basically it's cash poor, asset rich, and unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we use our land as our retirement. And this has just
the things
made us poor because of this inclusion tax, or raising the inclusion tax.
Yeah. Do you think that increasing the capital gains inclusion rate creates an incentive or a disincentive to young farmers who want to make the capital investment to start up or expand their family farms?
Oh, I'd very much say it's a disincentive. It gets back to my family's farm has been in our family for just over 100 years now. And it gets back, this is the first time that it's been, it's very questionable how we pass the farm on, just because of that the inclusion rate being increased. It's one of those things our asset, we can't move it, we can't do anything with it. It's in Canada, we can't move it, so we have to work with what we got.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lawrence. Baker, please. Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to start by asking some questions to James Gennaro, if I could. For the folks watching at home, could you just define what a caregiver is?
Certainly, very happy to. So in the terminology that we use, a caregiver is pretty much anybody who cares for anybody else. So everywhere from somebody caring for a child with a disability, a mom and dad with a child with a disability, say, on one end of the age spectrum, to somebody supporting their parents near the end of life or in long-term care on the other end of the age spectrum. In between is everything from lifelong disability, mental health, addiction challenges, episodic disability, you name it. The one part of this care space we don't really touch is childcare. We felt that space is pretty well served already, so our definition doesn't include childcare. But any other situation where you're caring for somebody who needs some help, you're a caregiver the way we see it.
And so by supporting caregivers, I guess there are different ways to support caregivers. There's ways we can support the caregivers themselves, but also, is it fair to say that when we provide better services, better healthcare services, for example, I'm thinking about long-term care, for example, that we're therefore supporting not only the person in that residence or the person requiring care, in this case the senior, but also supporting the caregivers. Is that fair?
There we go. That's certainly true. If you ask a caregiver what they need the most is help for the person for whom they're providing care. The second best thing you can do for a caregiver is to support the caregiver as well. So our view is that you can do both. And Canada, we're a G7 country, we surely should be able to do both at the same time. I'd also say that the data is pretty clear that when the caregiver isn't doing well, the person receiving care doesn't do well either. Just if you're in that situation of being burnt out, being financially distressed, unsure how you're going to pay the mortgage or pay the rent because of your financial strain related to care, you're not your best self when you're providing care for somebody, and ultimately the person to whom you're providing care ends up suffering at the same time.
Just in case we get there, I'll provide verbal notice of a motion that should the committee decide to have any extra resources tonight, we'll devote those to the study of Bill 365 to a maximum meeting time of an hour and report the bill back to the House in its original or amended form as the committee desires. That's just verbal notice. I'm not moving that motion, Mr. Chair, but we do have the proponent of the bill in the room and be prepared to present on his bill this evening. Mr. Harp, I'd like to just spend a couple minutes with you. Firstly, thank you for helping feed Canadians and the world. It's very much appreciated. And we saw that during COVID, food supply, obviously a very big concern. With recent government announcements, capital gains tax, other regulations, do you think farming is becoming more or less attractive to the next generation?
You know, farming in some ways is a way of life, and it's getting tougher to farm, and it's getting tougher for young Canadians to get involved in the farm. I think they still want to. I think they're still attracted to it, but it's getting tougher.
Thank you. I also understand that if you were to compare the emissions profile of Canadian grain or wheat that ends up being exported or consumed, that most Canadian agriculture products, but in particular grain, has a lower emissions profile than in other countries. Do I have that right?
I would believe so. Cal might have the numbers, but the one thing I would say, it gets back to we have been working on the land for years. We've been working, trying to be more efficient and more sustainable before that's become a buzzword. And so we've been working for years on this. So Kyle?
Yeah, I would just add that Canadian grain and Canadian grain farmers are some of the most sustainable in the world. We have a really good story to tell globally, and I'll quantify it. From 2001 to 2021, the Canadian agriculture sector cut its carbon intensity by 50% while growing food production to meet growing food demand both in Canada and globally.
So it sounds to me like it would be a good thing for the world to have more Canadian grain.
Yes, it would.
Be better for the environment too, right?
Yes.
I've never met a farmer who's not environmentally conscious. I've never met a farmer who wastes fertilizer, who doesn't think about the sustainability of their operation for the next generation. I think our government or any future government should look at ways to grow the agriculture sector so that we can export more food, keep more food supply chain here for us. What do you think about that?
And I totally agree with you. You know, it's we're doing very well now. I think we can do better, and I think we have an amazing story to tell. But you know, it's interesting. I think I was talking a little bit a few minutes ago about how our farm has been in our family for 103 years. I have 3 daughters that want to look at taking over that farm. Only way to make that farm viable, the only way to pass that farm on is to treat it, to treat the soil, to treat the farm the way it should be treated.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Harp. I appreciate your testimony. Mr. Lee, you can't get out of here with answering a couple questions for me, although if I know how this works, I'll probably only have time to ask you one, and you'll talk until the time is up. The Parliamentary Budget Officer today said, surprise, surprise, that inflation and interest rates have hurt lower income Canadians the most. Something that even the Governor of the Bank of Canada said in May of 2021, gave a speech, which seemed to fall on deaf ears with the current government. Do you have any comments on the role of inflation and how that's hurt low-income households?
I do appreciate the question. It has been studied, believe me, going back to Keynes. There's massive research on this, and I'm sure everyone in the room can guess at the answer. The people least affected, sorry for the jargon, but the top quintiles, the top 2 quintiles are the 2 highest, that's the 40%, they're very easy, it's very easy to immunize themselves from that, whereas people that are on the bottom quintile, the bottom 2 quintiles, have very, very limited income, and they're hit much harder. In fact, when you look at the StatsCan data that shows the percentage of income spent on food, shelter, etc., and they break it out by quintiles, well, it's no surprise that people in the bottom quintile pay a lot more as a percentage of their income on food and on shelter than wealthier people. Ergo, therefore, people at the bottom suffer a lot more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'm only a couple seconds over.
You know, in my downtown west riding of Davenport, transit is very popular. And so one of the things that troubles me is the fact that the transit in Toronto is largely funded by the fare box. And so can you just confirm whether or not we're the only country in the world that actually funds its public transit by the fare box? So that's question 1. And then part 2 is there a model of funding sort of at all the various levels of government of another country that you think we should be following?
Thank you for the question. With respect to your first question, I can say that Canadian transit systems rely on their fare box revenue to the greatest extent of any transit systems in the world. Don't know, what those exact percentages are, but I do know that Canadian systems do rely most heavily on fare boxes. In terms of models around the country, as I spoke about in one of our
around the world. If there's a model in the world that you would, not around the country.
Sorry, that's what I meant to say. My apologies. Around the world, what we recognize and what I talked about in my commentary was that all levels of government do need to participate. There are many examples around the world where you see various levels of government participating, and that's really what we need. But we need it to be, we need everybody to be on side with that versus a one-off. Typically what we've seen is federal government providing infrastructure funding with the operating falling to provincial and municipal, and that may well work as long as everybody's on the same page and they all understand their role that they have to play.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Lee, I wanted to touch on this questionable claim of the Minister of Finance that the increase of the capital gains inclusion rate only affects 0.13% of Canadians. And in your earlier testimony, you said you concurred with the analysis of Jack Mintz that this measure alone will blow a $90 billion hole in our GDP. Wouldn't it be more true to say that the increasing the capital gains inclusion rate doesn't only affect the 0.13% of Canadians, but in fact it affects every Canadian?
Yeah, Yes, it affects Canadians directly and indirectly. So just with the direct impact, when Ms. Freeland said that, I did several media interviews and I said, look, all we have to do, there's ways of testing data all the time, claims by anybody, including elected officials. And I said, all you have to do is look at the number of small businesses because they're subject, or medium-sized business, or farmers, because they're all subject to capital gains when they sell an asset for a capital gain. So there's many more than whatever it was, a very tiny percentage that was provided by the finance minister. When you look at the number of owners, entrepreneurs who own a capital asset called the business or farmers, and then you throw in secondary properties, of which there are several million, every one of those people are subject ultimately. They may not sell today, but when that property is sold, it will be hit with capital gains. So I knew that the number was ridiculously underestimated because there are several million people who have capital assets. That's why in my disclosure at the beginning, I was very careful to say that. I'm a very unusual person. I don't have any stocks or bonds. I don't have any capital assets other than my house, which is tax-free. But there are millions that do and are subject to this tax. So the impact is much greater than was claimed.
Thank you. And I'm sure that you've, over the years, studied the issue of tax fairness as well. And one of the things I found very curious about the policy is that if you're an individual or a sole proprietorship unincorporated, when you sell your capital asset, you get the first $250,000 with an inclusion rate at 50%. But if you happen to own the exact same business across the street and you happen to be incorporated, you don't get that. You could have exactly the same two businesses, exactly the same size, exactly the same asset mix, but one person gets a break and the other one doesn't. Could you comment on the inherent unfairness of that?
Well, it is unfair, but I think that the Tax Act over the years, over many, many years, has become riddled with a lot of inequities, which is why, and I've been arguing this for several years, I really do think we need another, I won't call it a royal commission, a blue chip panel that investigates this from stem to stern with experts, people like Jack Mintz, to analyze that, because there's a lot of inequities in the Tax Act.
Yeah. And in my last couple of minutes, I want to just get your take on the issue of the trend, the disturbing trend of the reduction in per capita GDP and productivity vis-a-vis the United States and the OECD, which you commented on earlier, because this is a trend that's not going in the right direction. It's going the wrong way. And I'm just wondering, if you were advising the government today, what suite of policies would you suggest they adopt to stem this very disturbing trend and reverse it?
Number one, I think that productivity is the number one crisis facing Canada because it drives the wealth and the future prosperity for every Canadian. So it's not some, even though people's eyes glaze over when they hear it, it's not some tangential or second order issue. It trumps everything else. But to your question, and I was here, I think, in April or May with your committee, and I sat beside the commissioner of the Competition Bureau, and we were both completely in agreement that one, and this is in the research, I assure you, in massive amounts of research, is competition. Because when you have markets that are not protected, and we're famous for protecting a lot of markets, like telecom, won't let the Americans in, airlines, banking, and go on. And that protection is pernicious and destructive and harmful to Canadians because Schumpeter taught us this 75 years ago. Companies innovate because they have to because of competition. If you have a nice, cozy, protected market provided by you, the parliamentarians, why should I innovate? Why should I invest in R&D? Why should I do any of that? Because I've got a nice, cozy, protected market. And so I said at that presentation, probably I offended some people here, many of you parliamentarians have created many of these problems by creating these protected markets like the telecom market and the dairy. And all we've done is hurt ourselves. We are causing harm to ourselves as individual Canadians.
Thank you.
Thank you, MP Morantz.
I wanted to ask one question, subsets of, but one question. Right now in Canada, we have a deficit to GDP about 1% or thereabouts. The equivalent in the United States is over 6%. And today, BMO came out with a really nice chart, and their deficit for fiscal year 24 is nearly $2 trillion. if we were running the same deficit to GDP in Canada, which we are not, our deficit would be probably 250 billion, maybe even closer to 300 billion dollars. So my point is, we have been, in our government, have been, I would say, excellent fiscal stewards in terms of maintaining our AAA credit rating and maintaining a strong fiscal framework. And the PBO officer, in the most recent report on the state of the government finances, when they look at the national and subnational levels, indicated that as well. And it is a strength. You would have to agree on that level that the state of Canada's fiscal finances are very strong, both on an absolute and relative basis. Would you not?
I will give a more nuanced answer, and I'm fully acknowledging that the United States is they're profligate with their deficit. Forgive me just for one moment. Everyone MP here should listen to the blog with David Rosenberg last May, and with former Deputy Prime Minister John Manley, and with David Dodge, talking about the 1995 downsizing, and talking about the current problem in the States. And he argues, all three argued it's not sustainable. They're going to run into a wall, a fiscal wall. It won't ruin the United States, but they'll be doing a haircut on all their social programs because they're the three largest drivers of the deficit. 75% of all the spending of the U.S. government is Social Security, Social Medicare, and okay, so you know that. To your question, I mean, the reason I said I want to nuance it, there's no reason to run, this is straight out of Keynes. There's no reason to run deficits when the economy is growing. You run deficits when the economy is in the tank, and then you pay them back so that just violates fiscal policy. And secondly, I don't quite agree with the statement made by the government because on the debt to comparing to other countries, because what they're doing is they're cherry picking. They're taking the federal debt and saying it as a percentage of total GDP. The OECD and all econometricians do not measure it that way. They measure the totality of government debt, federal, provincial, municipal, because there's only one taxpayer. And when you use that number, we are nowhere near as doing as well as is claimed.
I would respectfully disagree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. To be fair to to the rest of the panelists here, I'll give you a forewarning. I'm going to ask each of you if you have a recommendation that does not cost the government any money, and I'll give you some time to think about that, and I'll give you all an opportunity to discuss while I follow up with Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, I don't presume to know how old you are, but I don't know if you are aware, you can apply to become a senator. If you would like an endorsement from myself, I'd be happy to write you a letter. I'm not sure whether it'd be persuasive. There's some discussion about whether the government should consider a wealth tax. Is that something you would support?
No, I've spoken multiple times in debates with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives on this, and I think it would be catastrophic. There's two problems with a wealth tax. You get into the whole problem of measurement of wealth. You get into the question of timing, because then we're typically talking about taxing wealth that has not been liquidated. So you're going to somebody and saying, well, you're sitting on some stocks, so we're going to take some of it. And again, it's going to drive people to other countries because we're not the only country in the world.
Thank you.
So if we do that, people will go to the States.
Thank you very much. This is an academic question, but I know some people in the Parliamentary Budget Office watch this committee and they follow what's happening and people in the Department of Finance. Are you familiar with the term dynamic scoring? For example, there's three taxes the government has increased: luxury tax, capital gains tax, and the carbon tax. And for each of these examples, the government produces what they believe to be the increase of revenues that will be associated with those taxes. The problem is they present the gross number, gross taxes of revenue increase, not adjusting for the net effect of lost HST revenues, specifically as it relates to the luxury tax, or a reduction in GDP and therefore a reduction in general tax revenues. Would you support either the Parliamentary Budget Officer or the Finance Department including dynamic scoring, or what is commonly referred to as dynamic scoring, in their models?
I am familiar with it because I talk about that all the time in my classes, explaining that the economies are dynamic, and one of the criticisms I have of academia is that we look at everything when we're studying government and we think that's it's fixed, And we say, well, we can't do this because, but that it doesn't account for dynamism, and that's dynamic modeling. And dynamic modeling takes into account what you know in the behavioral finance literature. This is a very important part because people change their behavior in terms of the response. One more quick point, if I have time to get it in. I'm always struck by people who will tell you over and over how important the carbon tax is because it changes your behavior, and yet they do not acknowledge that any other tax changes our behavior too. The whole idea of a Pigou tax, which is a carbon tax, named after Professor Pigou at Cambridge, is that, you know, prices go up, you consume less of it. Well, this applies to any tax. It changes our behavior.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'd love to come audit any of your classes. Okay, I have about a minute and a half left. Happy to go either in order, or does anyone have a suggestion that is doesn't include an expense to the government? Yes, Mr. Gennaro. And please keep it short so we have enough time for the rest.
I hope this isn't cheating, but make the disability tax credit easier to access.
Fair enough. That's very good. Thank you very much. That's a great suggestion. Sir.
We have a number of recommendations that are no cost,
Okay.
and one that can bring in revenues. I'll just quickly go over. There's about $2 billion in existing funding that we could dedicate to restoration programs across Canada. Also suggesting that we make better progress on removing subsidies to fossil fuels and reducing subsidies that are harmful to nature. And we also have a recommendation for a windfall profits tax on oil and gas companies that could generate funding.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harp.
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to talk about capital gains tax and the carbon tax, but I think that costs money. So anyway, for us, interswitching would cost zero money and would actually benefit the agricultural industry greatly.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Roy or...
Yeah, well, I'm not cheating, but I'll stick to recommendation number 2, which is to integrate in the base budget the amounts. It won't cost more to integrate them to the base budgets.
Merci beaucoup. And I think we have one more witness online.
Yes, I would just reiterate our fourth recommendation, which was to encourage the government to take a leadership role in that national task force to talk about the best path forward for public transit systems in this country.
Pollution. I heard you mention earlier that the price on pollution is important in order to lower emissions, but also in order to protect the environment. Do you have a view on the idea currently being debated of exempting certain fuels or exempting certain activities from carbon pricing? Grain drying, for example?
Thank you very much for the question. We, as the Green Budget Coalition, those who have worked on the carbon pricing and mechanism recommendation, don't have recommendations that are specific to those types of applications or uses. I would say that we still sort of maintain a general position that it is an important mechanism and the sort of suite of mechanisms that are needed for putting a price on pollution and addressing climate change.
And are further exemptions going to undermine the system of a price on pollution? Yes or no?
Tough question to answer, and I don't think I have something solid for you. But what we want to see is that there is that sort of review of all of those related mechanisms. That we're looking at performance standards and output-based performance standards, prices on pollution, and how do all of them sort of work together to meet the needs that we need to meet, but also, of course, take into consideration any sort of undue consequences.